The first category consists of adherents of a feudal and patriarchal society which has already been destroyed and is still daily being destroyed by big industry and world trade and their creation, bourgeois society. This category concludes from the evils of existing society that feudal and patriarchal society must be restored because it was free of such evils, and one way or another all their proposals are directed to this end. This category of reactionary socialists, from all their seeming partisanship and their scalding tears for the misery of the proletariat, is nevertheless energetically opposed by the communists for the following reasons. 1. It strives for something which is entirely impossible. 2. It seeks to establish the rule of the aristocracy, the guildmasters, the small producers, and their retinue of the absolute or feudal monarchs, officials, soldiers, and priests, a society which was, to be sure, free of the evils of present-day society, but which brought it at least as many evils without even offering to the oppressed workers the prospect of liberation through a communist revolution. 3. As soon as the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their colors by immediately making common cause with the bourgeoisie against the proletarians. The second category consists of adherents of present-day society who have been threatened for its future by the evils to which it necessarily gives rise. What they want, therefore, is to maintain this society while getting rid of the evils which are an inherent part of it. To this end, some propose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform which, under the pretense of reorganizing society, are in fact intended to preserve the foundations, and hence the life of existing society. Communists must unremittingly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of communists, and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists who favor some of the same measures the communists advocate, as described in question 18, not as part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who are not yet sufficiently clear about the conditions of the liberation of their class, or they are representatives of the petty bourgeoisie, a class which, prior to the achievement of democracy and the socialist measures to which it gives rise, has many interests in common with the proletariat. It follows that, in moments of action, the communists will have to come to an understanding with these democratic socialists, and in general to follow as far as possible a common policy with them, provided these socialists do not enter into the service of the ruling bourgeoisie and attack the communists. It is clear that this form of cooperation and action does not exclude the discussion of differences. Now, this section is probably the easiest to grasp, but the hardest as well. Hypocritical as that sounds right now. What makes it easy? By the pure instance of three easily identifiable and contingently explainable divisions of socialism within historical and materialist lines, thus rendering this analysis still a dialectically materialist analysis. Yet, there is going to be hardness in grasping one thing from this section, which ultimately makes the section a tricky one if one's not really careful with the phrasing and wording of such. What makes it hard, in this section in particular, is this: the inclusion of the signifier of socialist within these three divisions. Maybe this is where we explicitly do have to step back and ask ourselves something. What is that something? That something is, how did the word socialist dialectically transformed itself from being easily divisible as it is right now in this section to now being a metaphorical signifier for communist, where clearly socialist sounds nicer than a communist, and communists describe themselves as socialists nowadays. Well, let's ponder that a little bit and wrestle with the history of ideas. The history, messily but clearly, can be stemmed back to its original coinage for the utopian project, which will later be classified as utopian socialist by Engels in, well, utopian scientific socialism. Then, as the movement continued on, it had a contingent event where it allowed the development to take place. It could become reformist. Thus, the name of reformist socialist came about, albeit its adoption will be more appealing later on. And later down the line, we do deal with socialists that originated as social democrats of that day. But they wanted to do more than what the reformist was willing to do. As being such, they wanted to go beyond the naming and attacking of capitalist symptoms. They wanted to, as we should say, root out capitalism. But these were early social democrats. The later social democrats, in fact, the most modern social democrats, will begin with Bernsteinism, or evolutionary socialists, which will later regress social democracy into becoming reformist socialist, which will forever stay as that way, and likewise reformist socialist being like its early counterparts, that of bourgeois socialism, which in fact was the original reformist socialism. So clearly, from a history of ideas standpoint, socialist was a term to describe as a reaction to capitalism that suddenly wanted to tackle such, whether it be the naming and attacking of symptoms, or the pure aggression of such, or to even go beyond the naming and attacking. But because of the multiplicity of such, it clearly was arbitrary, like all signifiers, of course. That is, to name oneself as a socialist without slapping a preceding word to clarify one's branch of socialism, much like postmodernism nowadays, much like into the Foucault postmodernists, to all the way to the post-structuralists, and even post-functionalists, if such exist anymore. Yet clearly, all these types of socialism for the communists wasn't doing enough, and they even wanted to go beyond what the original social democrats of their day was carrying out. So naming oneself as a communist clearly demarcated and delineated the extent one had to pass through if one was willing and serious enough to help workers supersede the bourgeois social order. But now, let us step forward and analyze each divisible type of socialist as they are presented here, conveniently from the reactionary to progressive kinds, in that order. The first named socialist is the reactionary socialist. The signified meaning of this type of socialist is already spelt out, but there is something worth talking about such. More along the lines of the history of ideas once more. It highlights, first of all, the core tenet of the universality of reactionaries, that being that they react to modern conditions and yearn for a time that can never be or never come to light. These reactionary socialists are very reminiscent of a very familiar community, that being the Dark Enlightenment and the reactionary modernists, fascists, if you like to say so. They yearn to go back to a point of history and restart society from there. In their words, not mine. But, unlike them, the reactionary socialist wants sympathy to destroy all that was made and enforce a gridlock on an impossible fantasy that can never be and never will stay always as that. In Marx's and Engels' time, these reactionary socialists were the feudalistic kind, and wanted a certain neo-feudalism, for they can never go back to the mercantile feudal order, nor even dream of becoming the late feudalism that they so earnestly want. Thusly, what they dreamt of was really a neo-feudalist order, considering the fact that the will of capital, and capitalism in general, had established itself, and have already, as we should say, redefined the superstructure to its advantage. Thus, any feudal ideas would become nigh on impossible, lest one were to destroy the base and reinforce the old mercantile feudal, or late feudal, base. Yet, they are willing, like the reactionary Marxists, or fascists, if you like to say it such, to cooperate with the existing ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and to destroy any movement that isn't working in their direction, and will even work against movements that want to displace and make even more impossible that crude step backwards in history. What a sight indeed for these kinds of socialists. The next named socialist is the bourgeois socialist. Again, it is signified as well, but let's dissect it a bit. What one should know right away, as earlier talked about, is the fact that bourgeois socialist is indeed, in every way, a reformist socialist when we consider their universal traits that they share with each other. In fact, reformist becomes the metaphor to replace bourgeois, yet keep the same signified meaning regardless. What changed truly is the metonymy, and reformist provides a more pleasant and anti-bourgeois stance than the original broadcasting of bourgeois socialism that sought to suppress the symptoms of capitalism so long as they had the means to do so. Truly they aren't revolutionaries for even trying to hide their past, and they will continue to do such with the usurping of Social Democrat. Which ironically enough leads to Social Democrats, or Demsocs as they are in this version of the Principles of Communism. The early Social Democrats clearly are the in-between of reformism that seeks to suppress symptoms of capitalism to the actual communists that wishes to root out the base superstructure of capitalism for something else. For back then, they were an easy medium to convert socialists and workers alike to the communist project. Yet these early social democrats would later become reformist socialists, or the evolutionary socialists, in accordance to Bernsteinism, and became an even neater package to the phrasing of reformist socialists, but for the capitalist class's use, in order to A. suppress class consciousness, and B. help create false consciousness in its place. This attitude is different in the different countries. In England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeoisie rules, the communists still have a common interest with the various democratic parties, an interest which is all the greater the more closely the socialistic measures they champion approach the aims of the communists. That is, the more clearly and definitely they represent the interests of the proletariat, and the more they depend on the proletariat for support. In England, for example, the working class Chartists are infinitely closer to the communists than the democratic petty bourgeoisie or the so-called radicals. In America, where a democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make the common cause with the party which will turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interests of the proletariat, that is, of the agrarian national reformers. In Switzerland, the radicals, though a very mixed party, are the only group with which the communists can cooperate, and among these radicals, the Vaudois and the Genevese are the most advanced. In Germany, finally, the decisive struggle now on the order of the day is that between the bourgeoisie and the absolute monarchy. Since the communists cannot enter upon the decisive battle between themselves and the bourgeoisie until the bourgeoisie is in power, it follows that it is in the interest of the communists to help the bourgeoisie to power as soon as possible in order the sooner to be able to overthrow it. Against the governments, therefore, the communists must continually support the radical Liberal Party, taking care to avoid the self-deceptions of the bourgeoisie and not fall for the enticing promises of benefits which a victory for the bourgeoisie would allegedly bring to the proletariat. The sole advantages which the proletariat would derive from a bourgeois victory would consist in various concessions, which would facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a closely knit, battle-worthy, and organized class, and in the certainty that, on the very day the absolute monarchies fall, the struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat would start. From that day on, the policy of the communists will be the same as it now is in the countries where the bourgeoisie is already in power. This section is probably a clear-cut example of historical materialism in usage. Why as such? Because it showcases the historicity of the communist movement to know what and how to deal with the material conditions and superstructure in their society as to move the communist project forward. And as such, they will stand with any party where they agree with them, and struggle where they explicitly and implicitly disagree with such. In the meanwhile, the communist is willing to do anything and everything they can do to help build the conditions that will be ripe for revolution, while assuring that they don't get consumed by the process and become the very bourgeois tools that they feared. Truly, the communist project seeks to advance society as to establish the conditions for such that will allow the communist revolution to come about, which will ultimately allow the communist project to abolish the current state of things. Yet at the same time, one could, like in the last section, have a problem with this section if they aren't careful. The wording of such is a tad bit tricky, to say the least. What is Engels suggesting with the usage of, explicitly, democratic parties? Well, clearly he isn't pushing a reformist socialist line, that still being a bourgeois socialist line, because that bridge has already been burnt in section 24 when he talked about bourgeois socialism. And clearly this isn't accelerationism, because most of these parties seek to help the prole and other prole subclasses to actually develop and become more and not less, which, in the end goal of accelerationism, one is to use democracy as to ruin society so much that somehow it'll build class consciousness, which has not been the case, at least when Great Depressions happen about. Also, there is no universal prescription of what a communist is supposed to do with democratic organs for each country, because each country will have a different usage of such as to advance the communist project forward, in lieu and yet in respect of the superstructure of the society, and an even heavier respect of the material conditions as such. But yet there is a universal description of what a communist is supposed to do. But I'll discuss that later. This is even explicitly shown where the communists in the advanced industrial countries are suggested to work with explicitly democratic parties in order to expand the rights of workers so they can breathe more, to where in Switzerland and America, it's the most radical and best party that is usually against the bourgeoisie is the one that they're supposed to work with, to where in Germany, where there is no consolidated will of capital, nor the bourgeois class, that there is a need for the communists to work together with the national bourgeoisie. And herein lie, in fact, some theoretical basis for what will later become Mao's new democracy, where the pros and the national bourgeoisie do have to team up to deal with the reactionary forces that prevent the march of history happening in that area. But where Engels and Mao demarcate is that Engels suggested to German communists the advice that they were given because Europe was already transforming towards capitalism, and it would be suicidal to just jump ship to communism, even if we were to take a voidist stance and ignore the fact that capitalism proper had barely even existed in Germany at all, and Germany still suffered from the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. And Mao, where he demarcates with Engels, at least within this section of course, is that they're already dealing with a world that experienced the communist project coming to life in the USSR, and they had the strength and knowledge of how to wield the petit bourgeois in their favor and keep them under control. In lieu of that fact, these particular prescriptions of each communist movement in each nation contingently fit with only 19th century communist movements, and would later have to change when the late 19th century rolled in, regardless of what has happened in the mid and early 19th century. So this section ought to be remembered as one thing, that it universally describes that we can universally use democratic organs to a very small extent to help build up communist projects when the occasion arises and when it's necessary to use such. But with later works in the Marxist tradition, it will only make sense to work on the local level, as the state/provincial level and the federal level was already bourgeois, and those seats would force and enforce the official or governmental official or the politician to concede the heavy bourgeois concessions to even have the seat in the first place, and it would only get worse as they have to retain the seat, and they will become more and more the thing that they hated and wanted to master over, using democratic organs on a very high and powerful level. And now we have officially reached the end of the Principles of Communism. The next work is Marx's Thesis on Führerbach, a very short work and should be easily dealt with.